Hello, and welcome to China Forum, the leading program for discussing the latest in trends and development in modern Chinese culture, politics, economics, and social issues. My name is Shannon Chiesi, and I will be your moderator for our program today. Today on China Forum, we will be exploring China's role in the Middle East. I am joined today by Ambassador Chaz W. Freeman, Jr. for our discussion. Ambassador Freeman is a former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia and former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. His 30-year career in U.S. diplomacy included acting as the principal American interpreter during President Nixon's 1972 visit to Beijing, as well as serving as Deputy Chief of Mission at the American Embassy in Beijing from 1981 to 1984. He is the author of the recent book, Interesting Times: China, America, and the Shifting Balance of Prestige. Welcome, Ambassador Freeman.
Good to be with you.
China has become an increasingly important player in the Middle East, both economically and politically. Its relationships with the various nations in this region could have global impacts. We'll start today by looking at China's reaction to the series of protests and uprising that have been dubbed the Arab Spring. The political turmoil caused by the Arab Spring has affected the diplomacy of every country within the Middle East region. How would you describe China's response to the Arab Spring and its effect on China's diplomatic relations in the region?
Well, I think the term Arab Spring is a problem for the Chinese, and it's extremely misleading. It basically evokes memories of the Prague Spring, which was part of the overthrow of communism in Eastern Europe, and it evokes an image of some sort of democratization movement that is against autocracy. But that isn't what happened. What happened was a series of uprisings against governments, expressing popular frustration and leading to a kind of populism which is heavily Islamist rather than interested in emulating Western democracy. When the Chinese first learned about this, the Western press, of course, was crowing that this represented some sort of Westernization or democratization of the Arab world at long last. The Chinese actually bought that line, and they were very alarmed because, of course, they have an autocratic system of government, and they have a history of mass violence in the Cultural Revolution, and before it, during the Civil War between the communists and the nationalists, and in earlier periods. So they were alarmed about their own stability, and they took steps to try to keep this phenomenon at arm's length. It didn't have much impact on their actual relationships with the region until the matter of Syria, which is the latest iteration of this sort of wave of unrest in the Arab world, came up.
Let's talk a little bit more about Syria. China has been criticized by both Western and Middle Eastern countries for blocking UN Security Council resolutions that were designed to deal with the crisis. Can you talk about the logic underlying China's response to Syria and what effect this could have on its future relations?
Well, this is a very interesting new development. Up to now, that is for the last several decades, China basically has been pretty passive internationally, and it's accepted the international order that the United States and other Western countries created pretty much without demanding change. But in recent years, the West, particularly Europeans, but also the United States, have begun to propose amendments to that order. For example, a concept of limited sovereignty, which includes the notion of a responsibility to protect. In other words, it allows humanitarian intervention in other countries, notwithstanding their status as sovereign states. And China has basically put down a marker that although it has accepted the previous order, it will not accept the West dictating how that order evolves. And it will not accept the reduction in sovereignty that the responsibility to protect implies. So in the case of the most recent instance, Western use of this doctrine to intervene in Libya, very quickly the shroud came off and it became apparent that the real objective was regime change. China is determined not to allow Libya to become a precedent for the fomenting of unrest in a country as a justification for intervening in it, which is what they think happened. And in the case of Syria, therefore, they've stood their ground quite firmly on this issue of principle, no intervention. They also have another reason for this, and that is they have a long border with Russia and a very rich and complex relationship with Russia, and they want to be on Russia's right side. And Russia does have concrete issues and interests in Syria that China doesn't. So they don't want to be crosswise with Russia, which happens to agree with them, by the way, more or less, on the issue of non-intervention.
Do you think that their refusal to engage in Syria the way Western nations and also some Arab nations have been calling for will hurt their diplomacy with other Middle Eastern nations in the future?
I think both Russia and China have paid a price for their stand on Syria. There are countries, particularly in the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which from the very beginning of the Syrian unrest had covert action programs assisting rebels against the Assad regime, which they detested. And their objective is very clear. They want to detach Syria from Iran. Syria has been a staunch ally of Iran, and they want to remove Syria as an asset for Iran. This is an interest they share with Israel, although of course Israel is not a partner in this enterprise, and to some extent with Turkey. So they have been, and by the way, it's an interest that the neoconservatives in the United States and others strongly espouse. The Chinese suspicion that what's behind this is an effort at regime change by external forces is not as crazy as it might at first appear.
Now, you mentioned China's interaction with Iran and other Middle Eastern countries' interactions with Iran. So let's talk about China and Iran. Especially from the U.S. perspective, there's been a lot of pressure on China to join in international efforts to sanction Iran to prevent it from developing its nuclear program. However, China is becoming an increasingly voracious consumer of energy, including Middle Eastern oil, including Iranian oil. So there's some sense that China might not be willing to go too far with these sanctions because of its energy concerns. So how is China balancing these calculations between trying to be a responsible global player and not upsetting its other allies or friends in the region, but also keeping its energy supplies intact?
Well, Iran is a dilemma for the Chinese because, of course, their major partner in the energy trade is Saudi Arabia, which is very concerned about Iran's nuclear program and very supportive of the sanctions program. On the other hand, China, which has a history of having been subjected to sanctions, Americans tend to forget that from 1950 to 52 anyway, until about 1971, China was subjected to sanctions by the United States and other members of the international community, which make the current sanctions on Iran look mild and forbearing. And the Chinese just don't believe that sanctions are an effective approach to changing people's minds. They think they produce recalcitrance, resentment, and a hardening of positions rather than reflection, repentance, reform, positive change. So there's a basic philosophical difference here. And the Chinese have to balance their interest in good relations with countries like Saudi Arabia or the United States, on the one hand, against their general stand against coercive diplomacy of this sort. The final point is, of course, much of the sanctions apparatus that's being applied to Iran is being applied outside the United Nations framework. And it's basically being applied because the United States has muscled other countries into complying with the U.S. foreign policy objectives. China doesn't like to be muscled. So I think this is an area of considerable ambivalence and ambiguity in the U.S.-China relationship as well as in the Chinese relationship with other countries in the Gulf concerned about Iran.
Mm-hmm. Most of what we've talked about so far has been political, strategic concerns, but there are a lot of analysts who feel that China's #1 concern for the Middle Eastern region is energy security. It's become the leading oil importer of Middle Eastern oil, and China is consuming more and more energy as its economy continues to grow. Do you feel that China's major concern in the region is oil, or is it a more balanced approach to these political concerns as well?
Well, I think China has a variety of interests in the Middle East, but the dominant one, without question, is energy and access to it. China hasn't had to deal with the political military aspects of this problem because the United States manages those for the world. It's the U.S. Navy that preserves freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf, as we saw during the Iran-Iraq War when the War of the Tankers occurred and the United States Navy stepped forward to halt that, or at least prevent it from being effective. So China, in a funny way, it doesn't like American power politics and gunboat diplomacy, but is a primary beneficiary of it. The interesting thing to watch as we go forward is as the United States becomes self-sufficient itself in energy once again. We were, of course, the largest exporter of energy until the 1950s. We're going to be again a major source of global energy supplies. If our interest in discharging these sort of policeman functions in the Gulf diminishes, will China step forward to take up part of the burden? Because clearly it's a main beneficiary. We could end up working with the Chinese to protect global energy supplies and the health of the global economy. Or we could end up working at cross purposes. Not clear how that's going to work out.
Right. And China has already developed some military connections with various countries in the Middle East, Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, the UAE. Do you see these connections expanding? And if so, is this part of China's strategy to help preserve its energy security for itself? Or is this a completely different calculation?
Well, so far these relationships, by and large, are arms sale relationships. They're not anything beyond that. They involve purchase by these countries on a cash basis of weapons from China that they find desirable and useful for their armed forces. Of course, along with this goes training and some degree of Chinese influence in the military calculations of those countries. But it's a very limited thing. I think it will grow, not so much because China wants it to grow, because taking on burdens in the Middle East is not something that most Chinese really want to do, but it will grow because the countries in the region are trying to diversify their international relationships and reduce their overdependence on the United States in any way they can. So they are trying to build new relationships, not just with China, but with India, if the Syrian issue had not intruded, with Russia, with Brazil, with Germany, with the EU, in addition to their traditional American, British, and French partners. So I think this military dimension will grow, but mostly as a result of demand from the Gulf rather than a push from China.
Mm-hmm. One example of this could be Egypt, which under its new leadership, President Morsi, has seemed like it's reaching out more to China. His first state visit outside the Middle East was to Beijing. If Egypt starts turning closer to China and distancing itself from the U.S., what effect is this going to have on the overarching geopolitical structure in the Middle East?
Well, Egypt, I think, is not an exception to others in the region in the sense that it is trying to reduce dependence on the United States. And of course, there are certain strains in U.S.-Egyptian relations, particularly over the extreme unpopularity in Egypt of the relationship with Israel that the United States brokered in the Camp David Accords, and which we continue to subsidize. I mean, basically, the United States provides aid to Egypt in order to keep them on side in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Egypt is going to continue to try to reduce this relationship with the United States and gain greater freedom of maneuver. And you can see this with Egyptian outreach, not just to China, but to Iran, for example, to India. You can see it with the rising role of Turkey in the region and Egyptian outreach to Turkey. I think this is a much more complex picture. We tend to see things very much in sort of bipolar terms. I don't think that's the way they have to be looked at. And again, it's the countries in the region that are driving the change, not China or, for that matter, the United States.
Right. In America, we tend to think of China as an Asia-Pacific nation, which obviously it's part of that community. But on its western side, it does border many countries that we would consider Middle Eastern, including Afghanistan and Pakistan, which means it might have an even more vested interest in the U.S. in maintaining good relations with these countries. There's been some speculation that China might play a larger role in rebuilding Afghanistan after the war there finally ends than the U.S. How do you think China and Afghanistan will work together in the coming years?
Well, you've made a very important point. China is not just a Pacific or East Asian country. It's also part of South Asia. Tibet is very much part of South Asia, and it's part of China, and it's not going to cease to be part of China. Xinjiang is part of Central Asia. And China, of course, also borders Russia. China and the United States rub up against each other in the military area, not just in East Asia, but in South Asia and in West Asia and in Russia. And we also rub up against each other on the high seas and in space. And now, of course, cyberspace as well. I would argue the United States is very poorly organized to deal with China because we deal with them almost entirely through the prism of the Pacific and the Pacific Command structure, which is a regional structure rather than a global one. We didn't deal with the Soviet Union when it was a global power from Europe. We dealt with it from Washington on a central basis. I think we're going to have to come around to doing that with China. Afghanistan, after the U.S. withdrawal, is going to be a problem for China and for everyone else. It seems almost certain that the Taliban will find their way back into control of the country. They don't have any reason to feel kindly toward China any more than they do toward the United States. Afghanistan, before the American invasion, was a training ground for Chinese Muslim dissidents, Uyghurs from Xinjiang, others. I think that's more likely than not to come again into the picture. So China has taken out some insurance against this by associating itself with other Central Asian countries. It too is a Central Asian country, and with Russia in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And the SCO is in large measure, from the Chinese perspective, directed not only at reducing great power rivalry on its western borders, but also at controlling the phenomenon of militant Islam and its destabilizing effects in China proper.
Let's talk a little bit more about the SCO. Right now, its two leading figures are China and Russia, and it also contains many of the Central Asian nations, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, those countries. And it includes Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran as observer states. So it seems posed to take on a larger function in the regional architecture. What do you think China's goals are for its participation in the SCO? And you touched on some of these issues, but I wonder if you could just expand a little.
Yeah, I think the SCO is becoming a very interesting gathering. Certainly from an economic point of view, like everything else in Asia, it is falling into the Chinese orbit. China is the center of Asia, and not just East Asia. Central Asia as well connects more and more to China economically. So that's a factor. With respect to Afghanistan, or post-American Afghanistan, I think there are a couple of considerations. The first is that beneath the surface in Afghanistan, there has been a very active contest going on between India and Pakistan for influence. India sees Afghanistan as Pakistan's rear area. Pakistan also is concerned not to allow India to flank it by establishing a position of influence or dominance in Afghanistan. And the two have been contending through proxy forces in Afghanistan and will continue to do so, presumably, perhaps even at a more violent level when the United States withdraws, NATO withdraws from Afghanistan. The second point is that the concerns the Chinese have about Afghanistan in terms of it becoming a sort of training ground and safe rear area for Islamic militants are shared by everybody else in the SCO. Tajikistan's had a civil war that pitted militants against others. Uzbekistan has had internal unrest which has to do with this. Kyrgyzstan has been relatively immune but is also concerned. Kazakhstan does not want to see the import of militant Islam into its territory because of its destabilizing effects. And obviously Russia, which has its own problems internally with militant Islam in places like Chechnya and Dagestan and so forth, doesn't want to see this become a problem on its eastern flank. So I think the SCO is likely to be much more active on the Afghan issue and could play a useful role in generating some sort of international support for more moderate regimes in Afghanistan after the American withdrawal.
Another country that the U.S. has often had issues with in this region is Pakistan. And in contrast, China and Pakistan have historically had a fairly stable, fairly close relationship. What role do you think China will play in terms of helping to stabilize the sort of chaotic situation that Pakistan's going through with its own issues with militants?
Well, I don't know that China can do very much about the internal situation in Pakistan, but China has been a reliable partner of Pakistan since it first built that relationship after the Sino-Indian border war and in the 60s. And it's been constant. U.S.-Pakistan relations have gone through quite a roller coaster ride, sometimes very good, sometimes very bad, and they're very bad in many respects at the moment. China has a relationship with Pakistan basically out of geopolitical motivations. It does not want India to be unchallenged as the hegemon in South Asia, and therefore it supports Pakistan. Pakistan is its largest market for arms exports. It has cooperative weapons development programs with Pakistan, which are important. And it has a concern as a neighbor of both India and Pakistan to keep India and Pakistan from going to war, and the possibility that it might be a nuclear war adds to that concern. So I don't think China really is able to do much in Pakistan internally, and certainly we haven't done anything terribly positive in Pakistan internally. But it is very concerned, and it does have a role in Pakistan's external relations. And I think it's been a moderating force by and large in that context.
Now, we've discussed numerous factors that are leading China to engage more in the Middle East, its own security concerns with its neighbors, its energy concerns. And generally, China is viewed more positively in the region than the U.S. So as China's interests in the region grow and as Middle Eastern countries reach out more to China, is there potential for China to become a regional player on par with or even surpassing the U.S. in terms of its importance in this region?
I doubt it. And the reason I doubt it is that China doesn't have and doesn't appear to want to develop the kind of power projection capability that is central to the American purpose internationally. We, of course, didn't have this until World War II. And China resembles us before World War II in many ways. It's somewhat isolationist and doesn't want to get itself involved militarily. It follows George Washington's admonition against entangling alliances pretty religiously. So I don't think the Chinese are going to get entangled in the Middle East in the way that we have done. But on the other hand, they are becoming much more of a presence in the Middle East. Chinese labor is everywhere. Chinese construction companies are everywhere. Chinese technology and Chinese products are everywhere. I mean, for example, Chinese automobiles are manufactured in both Egypt and Iran now. They're becoming a big seller in the Gulf. So I think China's economic, cultural ties and maybe political cooperation with Arab countries in particular is likely to grow considerably. But I don't think it will resemble the sort of militarily dominated relationship the United States has had.
Okay. And for one final question, and I know it's a big one, but I wonder if you could talk about what implication China's role in the Middle East is going to have on the U.S.'s future calculations as it tries to strategize for its Middle Eastern relations in the coming years.
Well, China is, as your question implies, not just a regional power, but a potential global power. In economic terms, China is already a great power on the global level. It is not a great power politically, and it lags far behind militarily. It is not a great power politically because the Chinese model is not attractive to anyone, not even to a lot of Chinese. It works, it delivers economic growth, but it does not deliver the kind of participation in public life that middle-class people, including the Chinese middle class, really want. So politically, China is not very influential anywhere, and that includes the Middle East. It's not a model that anyone wants to emulate. Militarily, as I said, I don't think the Chinese show much interest in becoming a global military power. What they do seem to be interested in is defending their immediate periphery, and they're acquiring an ability to do that pretty convincingly. So I'm not sure how China will figure in American calculations about the Middle East. There's one sort of obvious major point, and that is China, like India, like Brazil, like other countries, is becoming a real force. And the United States is not in a position anymore to call the shots everywhere, not even in the Middle East.
Oh, thank you so much, Ambassador Freeman. I'm sure our viewers learned a lot from the discussion. I know I did. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you also to our audience. We'll see you next time on China Forum.
Thank you, Jen.